I love the words of Timothy, of Paul. I love the words of Paul's letter to Timothy, and later his letters to Titus. These two sets of letters are very personal and very distinct among Paul's letters, for though they are instructive of things that are very worldly and things that affect the lives of all men and all people of Christ, they are so personal to Paul's companionship with these men. You can hear the love that Paul has of these men that have been companions for years of his life. And you can hear him still teaching them. Throughout their lives, Timothy and Titus always addressed Paul as Rabbi, teacher, even though he always told them after a point, I am no longer your teacher. You are no longer my student. But for them, it was an address of honor. It was an address of not technical, but they loved him so dearly, and they respected him so very much. Excuse me. When you read or hear read the letters of Peter or the epistles of John, you hear very different voices. Listen for the different voices within the gospel, because these different voices are what have created your Christian beliefs. The major writers of the Bible are, of course, Paul, and then John, for John wrote the Gospel of John, and then he wrote the epistles of John. But when you read Revelations, you will know immediately that this is not the voice of John. If you have read any of the books of the prophets, you will immediately recognize that the book of Revelations is the voice of God coming through the hand of John. Because John merely dictated what God told him to write. John had the visions which God gave him. Thus it is God's voice that John is dictating, and you can clearly hear it. Read Ezekiel, read Isaiah, and when you hear Isaiah speaking, it is very clear when Isaiah is speaking. But then, when he is speaking in his prophet's voice, when he is speaking the words of the Father Almighty, his voice and his manner changes entirely, and he is speaking the words of God. In the same way, Ezekiel, he is a rather coarse fellow, but when he is speaking the words of God, it is the same voice as in Isaiah. The same exact voice as you hear in Revelations. So the writers in the Bible, you have Paul as the major writer, for he wrote the majority of the New Testament. Then you have John, who wrote the Gospel of John, the Epistles of John, and his hand wrote the Revelations, but it is the voice of God. And then you have Luke, and then you have Matthew. The writer of Acts of the Apostles and and Mark are two minor writers. Mark wrote a gospel, yes, but it is by far the shortest gospel by 66%. And the writer of Acts of the Apostles, it's a book that some claim there's 3 writers. And when I read it, sometimes I hear periodically another voice, but it's a majority one voice. Now you may say, what do I mean by a voice? Read all of the Gospel of Matthew. You hear his voice. He has a very distinct style of talking, a very distinct style of relating things. And even though it's one of the synoptic Gospels, he speaks differently, talks differently than does Luke. Though they talk of the same stories, they relate stories differently. Even the story of the centurion, it is told differently in the 2 different Gospels. That is a voice. So when you listen or read a Gospel, listen for the voice of the writer, because that is the person who has formed you, who has formed your thoughts, who has formed your beliefs, who has, with the hand of God, formed your Christianity. Know which one has had the greatest influence on you. For me, I know it is Matthew, with John as second, for it is their Gospels that reach out to me. And you might say, how can one synoptic Gospel have a different touch on you than another? It is his writing. It is his voice. Listen for his voice. Because I know that different Gospels touch each of you differently. Know which one it is that is your favorite. Be able to say, I like this one better. And you don't have to defend it. It is his voice that you like. He speaks to your heart. He touches your soul. That is the way of God. Have a safe and blessed day. I will see you tomorrow. May the Lord Jesus Christ and the peace of the Lord touch each of you always.